Hey everyone, Glenn here from RewiringTinnitus.com. I wanted to take a few minutes today to talk about tinnitus, and more specifically about habituation. I think it's a really important concept and one that's widely misunderstood. So I wanted to create this video to talk a little bit about what it is, what it isn't, what it's like to habituate to the sound of your tinnitus, what it's not like, and hopefully I'll be able to answer some of your questions and clear up some of the common misunderstandings. But before we get into that, let's talk for a minute about what tinnitus is. Most people know the medical definition, which is the perception of noise in the ears when there isn't any. Some people hear clicks, chirps, whistles, tones, buzzing, whooshing. There's a whole wide variety of noises, different noises that people hear. Some people hear multiple noises. It can be very loud. But ultimately, it is a symptom of one of many underlying conditions. It is not a condition in itself. And the sound of tinnitus is only one part of the problem. So what is tinnitus? Well, according to the neurophysiological model of tinnitus that was created in the early 90s by two researchers named Jonathan Hazel and Pavel Jastreboff, it starts with a closer look at the inner ear. Inside the inner ear, you have the cochlea, where the vibrations of sound are translated into the electrical signals our brain can understand. And you have thousands of these tiny sensory organs called hair cells. And there's a lot going on. There's a lot of mechanical activity, there's a lot of electrical activity, and it creates a very noisy environment. Now this is important to understand because it's been shown that even people without tinnitus can hear the sounds of tinnitus under the right conditions. In the 1960s, two scientists named Heller and Bergman created an experiment, a study that's been replicated several times in the following decades, where they recruited college students. And the college students were led to believe that they were having their hearing tested, but in fact, they were not. They were placed inside a sound-absorbing booth, and they were given headphones and told to press a button anytime they heard sounds being played through the headphones. Now, for 5 minutes, no sounds were played, but 93% of the students reported hearing whistling, buzzing, and whooshing sounds, all the same sounds that people with tinnitus report. So what they showed was that just about everyone is capable of hearing the background mechanical and electrical activity present in the cochlea, in the nerve pathways from the inner ear to the brain. So the key takeaway here is that tinnitus is essentially a harmless sound. It's a natural sound. The problem is that our brains are turning up the volume of these natural internal sounds as a way to compensate for some change in our hearing environment. Now there's a lot more research that is needed to understand what's actually going on inside the brain and why this overcompensation happens. But the key takeaway, again, is that it's essentially a harmless sound. The only difference between someone who's tortured by their tinnitus and someone who isn't is that the person who's bothered by their tinnitus is reacting emotionally as if they were in danger. So it's our reaction to tinnitus, our emotional reaction, that causes the problem. It's how tinnitus becomes so problematic. Now, right now, there's still no cure for tinnitus. There's no reliable way to reduce the loudness or intensity of the sound, so our only option is habituation. So what is habituation? Habituation is a mental process where we can tune out meaningless background noise, and we do this all the time. We do it automatically. It's how you're able to carry on a conversation inside of a restaurant and not be overwhelmed by the noise of everyone talking around you. It's how you're able to focus in a coffee shop and work on your computer even though people are having conversations around you. It's called habituation, and it's something we do very well. But the problem is, it is simply impossible to tune out and habituate to a sound that implies danger or carries a negative association of any kind. And if you think about this, from an evolutionary point of view, it makes a lot of sense. You wouldn't want to tune out the sounds of danger. We use sound to monitor our environment for danger, for threats. And it's helped us survive as a species. So why are we perceiving tinnitus as something dangerous? Well, when you get tinnitus for the first time, the sudden onset of a loud noise is terrifying. So our first response is fear. We have a fear response, and as time goes by and it doesn't go away, we start to worry that we have a permanent problem and the fear response grows stronger. We maybe go to a doctor and the doctor tells us, well, there's no cure. A lot of people are told they just have to live with it. And that's also a very terrifying idea. And all the while, the noise becomes more intrusive. It's essentially putting you into a low-level state of fight or flight. You're having a stress response. Your body's releasing stress hormones. And during fight or flight, our senses are heightened. We can run faster, we can hit harder, we can see more clearly, and its purpose is to enable us to either address a specific threat or to get away safely. But in the case of tinnitus, the noise is constant, and the threat never goes away. So we're caught in this vicious cycle. And the harder we try to ignore it, the harder our brain will fight to redirect our attention to the source of the perceived threat. So ignoring it doesn't work. It's essentially not a good strategy. I've never been able to ignore away an emotional problem, a psychological problem, yet a lot of us, that's our impulse with tinnitus. We try to ignore it, but we can't, and that further fuels our frustration. So with habituation, you can habituate to the sound of your tinnitus, but you have to first rewire your emotional response. Think of Pavlov and his dogs. Pavlov would ring a bell every time he fed his dogs, and eventually, just by ringing the bell, the dogs would begin to salivate. Well, with tinnitus, the problem happens when you have a negative conditioned response. You hear the sound, and it causes tremendous stress and anxiety, and it overwhelms your mind and becomes impossible to ignore. But we can habituate to it if you can rewire the emotional response. Now, there's several different ways to do that, and I will cover some of what worked for me in a future video. But I want to explain what it's like to habituate. So, when I've written about tinnitus, one of the common things I hear from people is that my tinnitus is very loud. It's impossible to ignore. I'd never be able to ignore my tinnitus. And I know this is a really hard concept to wrap your mind around when your tinnitus is blaring at an extremely loud volume all the time. But when you habituate, so let's start with what it is. When you habituate, just like you would tune out the sounds of other people talking in a restaurant, the sound of your tinnitus is no longer at the forefront of your mind. It stops grabbing your attention all the time. It does not go away, not necessarily. But because you're not thinking about it all the time, it seems quieter. A better way to explain it is that it stops bothering you. So it's not a problem anymore. It's still there, but and oftentimes it can spike and be at a very loud volume. But it stops bothering you in a way that's intrusive and allows you to go back and go about your life as you used to. I read a good analogy in a book by Julian Cowell, who's a tinnitus expert, where he compares it to wearing socks. When you're wearing socks, you don't think about the fact that you're wearing socks. But if you focus on your feet, you can feel the socks. But most of the time, you're not going to be doing that. I think that's a pretty good analogy for tinnitus. It's maybe not a perfect analogy, especially if you have very loud tinnitus. But when you habituate, it does seem quieter. And even if it's not actually quieter, it feels quieter because you're not focused on it anymore. As you start to habituate, you'll find days have gone by where maybe you only thought about your tinnitus a couple times. And the further along the path you get, it gets to a point where you will only think about it when you choose to, or if someone brings it up, and eventually you can even get to the point where even when you are focused on it, it still doesn't bother you. Now, habituation is not a cure. I want to be clear about that. If your tinnitus changes in some significant way, if you have a terrible spike in volume or intensity, there's a good chance that even after you've habituated, you'll still have that old reaction. You'll still have that old negative emotional reaction. However, it won't affect you like it used to, even if you have that same emotional reaction, and you can still rehabituate to the sound of your tinnitus again. I find it's easier the second time around. When I have a bad spike now, I'm able to very quickly resolve that negative emotion and go back to being okay. I still hear it very loudly, but it doesn't intrude into my life and my awareness like I know it does for many of you. So habituation is the ability to essentially tune out the sound of your tinnitus most of the time. It's still there. It does not go away, but you are able to ignore it somewhat effectively and more of the time. And even if you feel tortured by your tinnitus now and feel like you'll never be able to ignore it, on the one hand, you're right. As things stand now, you probably won't be able to ignore it. But if you can remove the barrier to habituation, which is the negative emotional response, and replace it with one that's emotionally positive or at least emotionally neutral, habituation can happen naturally, and you will be able to tune it out, or at the very least, you won't be focused on it all the time. And your quality of life and will rise substantially, and it's an experience of relief. I feel like at the end of the day, there may not be a cure, but if you can habituate to the sound of your tinnitus and it stops bothering you, it's ultimately the same thing. In fact, I'd argue that it's even if they do create a cure for tinnitus one day, learning to habituate to the sound is an important skill to have, because if a pill can make the sound go away and then something else makes it come back again that there is no pill for, you won't be able to handle that. So regardless of what the future holds for medicine and tinnitus, and I think it does look very positive, there's a lot of companies working on cures for tinnitus right now, I think ultimately habituation is the best we can hope for, and it should be the goal for everyone suffering with tinnitus. So in future videos, I'll talk more about what worked for me and how I was able to finally overwrite that negative response and habituate to the sound of my tinnitus. But for now, I hope I answered some of your questions. Have a good day, everybody.